make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
The Bible and the will of the people are in conflict. What then? Which should prevail? Which should have more influence? Is it the Bible or is it the will of the people? And respondents can tell us. They can choose or they can volunteer that they'd rather not answer the question. And what we find is that about half of the public says they want the Bible to have at least some influence over U.S. laws. And a little more than half of them, 28% of U.S. adults, tell us that if the Bible and the will of the people conflict with each other about this or that, they think the Bible should actually take priority. The U.S. law should reflect the Bible, not the will of the people.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers on our YouTube channel. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, thanks.
And today we have with us Gregory A. Smith. He's an associate director of research at Pew Research Center. He helps to coordinate the center's domestic polling on religion. He also writes and reports and provides information to news media and others about religion and public opinion, religion, American politics, and the political views of Catholics. Smith holds a doctorate in government from the Mighty Cavaliers at the University of Virginia, which he was a fellow at, the Center on Religion and Democracy. And we are so delighted to talk with him today about a pretty hefty 60-plus page report that he wrote about religion in America. So welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you for having me. Great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. And so I guess maybe you can just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and like, how did you get started in this field?
Yeah, of course. My background is in political science. I have a PhD in government from the University of Virginia, and I've been at Pew Research Center ever since I finished my graduate work in political science. I've been at Pew Research Center since 2005. I wrote a dissertation on religion and politics. Specifically, I wrote a dissertation looking at the political influence of Catholic priests. This was back in 2004, 2005, right after the Kerry Bush campaign. And I happened to be finishing my graduate studies just at the time when Pew Research Center was looking for somebody who could work with data, who knew something about survey research, and had a background in religion and politics. And I've been here ever since, almost 20 years now.
That's pretty amazing. So, I mean, like, is the majority of your like work just dealing with numbers, or is it more dealing with people?
The majority of my work is dealing with numbers, and maybe one place to start is by saying a little bit about Pew Research Center, about who we are and what we do. We are a non-profit, non-partisan, non-advocacy fact tank. We refer to ourselves as a fact tank to sort of distinguish ourselves from the many other organizations in Washington, think tanks. Yes. And what we try to do, what our mission is to do good, solid, objective, up-to-date research on the issues and trends shaping the United States, and that's what I focus on, and shaping the world more broadly. So our research tends to be very quantitative. We do a lot of survey research, polling, that's what I work on, but we also do some other kinds of quantitative research. We do demographic analysis. We have a unit focused on big data, some new computational social science techniques, but a lot of our work is indeed quantitative. It's working with numbers. It's working with people, of course. You know, the numbers come from data we collect by asking people questions. But most of our work is, in fact, quantitative and statistical. One thing worth emphasizing about Pew Research Center is that we really are very serious about our non-advocacy stance. We don't take positions on any political issues. We don't endorse candidates. We don't endorse particular public policies. We also don't take any positions on religious issues. We don't favor this or that religious position or religious group. We really do our very best to be as objective and impartial as we possibly can.
Yeah, I really love that. And I love the designation of fact tank instead of think tank. It's I'm sure there are many phrases and funny jokes that you can make from that around the office and the water cooler, so to speak.
Yes.
So, yeah.
It often takes some explaining. We have to tell people what we mean by that. But yes, it's a good.
Yes, of course. So, I have in recent years gotten really interested in methodology, because methodology helps us to deal with the bias that we have, because our biases are always there and will come out in whatever we do, right? So we try to use methodology to help to mitigate against that. So if you could, just for a few moments, walk us through the methodology behind research on Americans' perceptions of religion and even politics and the influence in public life. Like, how do you ensure the reliability and validity of these findings when you're talking about issues that are so bias laden, both on the side of the researchers and surveyors and the participants?
Yeah, great questions. A lot of our work at Pew Research Center and pretty much all of the work that I focus on, it comes from surveys. It comes from we conduct polling. We ask people their opinions about this or that. We ask them about their characteristics. We ask them about their experiences. We ask all kinds of questions. So when I think about methodology, maybe that's the place to start. I'm talking about survey methodology. How do you conduct good public opinion polling? And I could probably talk for 3 hours about all the considerations that go into that, but maybe I'll start by focusing on a couple things. One is, maybe the place to start is, you need to have a good sample of people to whom you administer your questions. What do I mean by a good sample? I mean a representative sample of the broader public that you're trying to represent. And in our case, that's typically the adult population of the United States. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the people we're asking to participate in our surveys represents a good representative, probability-based sample of the total population. So we want to make sure we have the right balance of men and women, that we have the right balance of younger people and older people, the right balance of people with college degrees and those with lower levels of education, the right mix of race and ethnicities, the right mix of income levels, the right mix of geographies, that we have people from all over the country and not just in this or that place. So that's the place to start. You need to have a good sample that's not biased too heavily toward one group or another. And I can talk more if you'd like about how you actually go about building that kind of sample. But that's the place to start. You need a good representative sample. Once you go ahead.
I was going to say, I am kind of curious. So keep sort of like pulling on this thread, because I'm really fascinated by sort of like how you get your sample.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.
So there's a variety of ways you can go about constructing a good representative sample. In our case, almost all of our surveys in the United States these days are conducted on what we call our American Trends Panel. We sometimes refer to it as the ATP, American Trends Panel. This is a group of people, a group of Americans, currently more than 10,000, who have agreed to participate in an ongoing series of surveys that we conduct at Pew Research Center. We recruited these folks initially through the mail. which some people find surprising in today's high-tech age, but that's actually how we recruit our respondents. We send a letter in the mail to a randomly selected group of addresses from all across the country and invite a person at that address to join our American Trends panel. We ask them to come online, complete a survey about some of their basic demographic traits and a few basic attitudinal questions. And then we invite them to join the American Trends panel. And what you do, what you wind up with when you employ that kind of approach is with that random sampling, you sort of maximize your chances of getting a good representative sample. Not too much of this group, not too much of that group, but a group that's broadly representative of the general public. Does that answer the question?
It does. And for our younger audience members, the mail is this form of communication that gets delivered to a mailbox. So just in case there's any confusion for any of the young folks out there. So
that's right. Now I should clarify that we recruit folks by mail. That's how we invite them to join our American Trends panel. That's how we initially contact them. But once we've contacted folks and they've agreed to join the American Trends panel, the ATP, then the surveys they participate in moving forward are administered online. So once we've got them into the panel, we can then conduct the surveys much more quickly than it would take to actually send out a mail questionnaire for every single survey we conduct and wait for them to send back their responses. So people are recruited by the mail, but then they actually participate in the ongoing series of surveys online. It's worth stating too that one question we often get is, well, what about almost everyone in the U.S. adult population, not everyone, there are some exceptions, but the huge majority of the public is associated with an address. Most people have an address at which they can be reached. So when we invite people by the mail to join the panel, we have that assures us that almost everybody in the population has a chance of being selected and invited to participate in our surveys, and that's very important. But of course, not everyone has internet access. Not everyone is online. So if our surveys are conducted online, but not all Americans are online, well, what do we do? Well, historically, what we've done is provide them with internet access. We provide them with a device and with I don't know the details of the subscription that they get, but they get a subscription so that they're able to go online and participate in our surveys that way, even if they didn't previously have internet access before we contacted them. So that's one example of the kinds of steps that we take and the kind of care that we exercise to try to make sure we've got a good sample that really is representative of everyone.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, but like, how do you? So like when you're doing religious surveys, like how do you know like what their faith background is or isn't, and that like the majority of your sample size aren't, largely, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things to know. One is we simply ask them. We ask people tons of questions about their religion. We ask about their religious identity. We ask about their religious beliefs, their religious practices, their religious upbringing, their religious experiences. So we ask people tons of questions, and over time, that sort of results in the accumulation of a great deal of information about the religious characteristics of our respondents. And how do we know that we have that we don't have too many of this or that group in our sample? Too many in the sense that we wouldn't want to bias our sample. The steps we take to build the sample in the first place sort of ensure that the religious groups on the back end are represented in their proper proportion. So in our samples, we can see from the questions that we ask people that most respondents, about 6 in 10 or so, give or take, are Christians. They identify as Protestants or Catholics, or smaller shares identify as Latter-day Saints or as Orthodox Christians. But about 6 in 10 people in our samples are Christians. The next largest group after Christians is people who say they have no religion. Atheists and agnostics, people who say they are nothing in particular when we ask them about their religion. We sometimes talk about that big group as the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S. And religious nones, the religiously unaffiliated is another term we use for them. They account for about 30% of the U.S. public. So just right there, between Christians at about 60% and nones at about 30%, that gets you to like 90% of the public. And then we have a bunch of other groups that are represented in much smaller numbers. So Jewish respondents, for example, typically account for about 2% of our respondents. Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus each account for about 1% of our respondents. And then there's lots of other religious groups represented in smaller numbers as well. So that's sort of how we make sure that our religious groups are represented in their proper proportions. We start out with that high quality random sample, and then that assures you on the back end that the religious groups will be represented in about their proper proportions.
Okay, so how should a layperson like myself interpret results? I mean, in 2016, 2017, with all the polling for the presidential election, it's like, I don't know how many people I've talked to that were like, yeah, polls don't mean anything. Surveys don't mean anything. Like how should the average reader approach, like the results in your report? So like when there's a result in your report. So like 70% of white evangelical Protestants say it's important to have a president who shares their religious beliefs. So like, do we walk away from that and say objectively that, yes, 7 out of 10 white evangelicals believe this thing. So kind of help us better understand, like as a consumer of the data you produce, like how should I interpret those results?
Good question. So a couple things to point out. Let's see where to begin. Maybe the place to start is with a comment about transparency. So people who do the kind of research that we do, by which I mean sort of research meant for public consumption, research that we want to use to reach the public, and we want people to be able to use it to inform their understanding of the world around them. People and organizations doing that kind of research should disclose key information about the research they've conducted. You should be able to find information about, okay, this is a survey. Who was sampled for this survey? How was the sample constructed? And we've just been talking about how we do some of that at Pew Research Center. The way we do it isn't the only way to do it, but as a consumer of public polling, you should be able to find information about how the poll you are examining was conducted. How was the sample selected? That's number one. Another kind of information you should be able to find about a poll as you're evaluating it is what questions were asked. Literally, what was the wording of the questions? That will allow you as a consumer of polling to make your own judgments about whether or not these questions were fair and balanced or were they biased? Were they questions that are likely to have produced an objective picture, or are they going to have led respondents in one direction or another? As a consumer of public It's not that all pollsters are going to agree about the best way to ask a question, but as a consumer, you should at least be able to see, what did they ask? So you can decide for yourself if you think this or that was a fair question, or whether on balance, all the questions in a survey would work together to paint a good objective picture. And then maybe the third thing I would say is all consumers of public opinion polling should remember that what we are measuring here are indicators. And they do not, all estimates that come from surveys have a margin of error associated with them. And what that margin of error means is it's not an indicator that the result is right or wrong, but it's a suggestion that if you were to do that same survey over and over and over again, many times among different samples of people, what's the likelihood that you would come up with the particular result you found in that survey? So for example, you'll often see that in surveys of about 1,000 people, you'll see that the margin of error for the survey is plus or minus 3 percentage points. So what that means is if you take that survey and you can see that 55% of people said X, then you have a pretty high degree of confidence that the actual share of the public that believes that is somewhere between 52% on the low end or 58% on the high end. It's somewhere in that range. These are indicators in that sense. It's not the case that it's exactly 55%. And not 54% and not 56%. In that case, public opinion polling is a little different than other kinds of scientific measurement. Like if you think about measuring the weather, measuring like the temperature, we have very precise instruments that can tell us exactly what the temperature is. Right. And if it says it's 87, that means it's 87, not 84 or 91. It means it's 87. Polling doesn't work that quite that way, and that's something that consumers of public opinion polling should bear in mind. Now, the research organizations should tell you what that margin of error is, not just for the full sample, but for the individual groups that are analyzed in their reporting. So you can tell, the margin of error is a little lower for white evangelical Protestants, which is a pretty big group, than it might be like for Jewish respondents, which tends to be a smaller group. So you should have that information available to you, and it can help you make sense of the results.
And does that margin of error tends to shrink the larger representative group you have?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
The margin of error is largely a function of the size of the sample you have. So a sample of 10,000 respondents is going to be more precise. It's going to have a smaller margin of error than a sample of 1,000 respondents. And a sample of 1,000 respondents is going to have a smaller margin of error than a sample of 100 respondents. So yes, it's not always a direct correlation. There are other factors that come into play, including details about like how the sample was drawn. But yes, in general, larger samples have smaller margins of error associated with them. That's assuming they're based on probability random sampling. If you have some other kind of survey where you just sort of ask people that you run into on the street in a particular city what they think, that's not a random sample, and so that's not going to have any margin of error associated with it. It's just a different thing entirely.
Gotcha. So, I mean, that's super helpful. I've never had that explained to me quite that well. So I really appreciate that, because that's really helpful in looking at this data, because I think that is one of the, probably most misunderstood things that people hear a lot is margin of error and what that actually means. And, I have one more process question, and then we'll move on to the findings of the survey itself. When you're conducting the survey, like I'm thinking right now of religious nuns, NONES, which it's such an unfortunate term in some ways, because so many people just think of religious nuns as Catholics, that are in a monastery or, wherever it is they might. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not sure. But the nuns, people that have no religious affiliation, so this is kind of a double-sided question in a sense. Like, were those making up such a large proportion of the population? Yeah. Is the idea, or in your research, has that been that most of them were Christians? If you were to survey them 30 years ago, and now they're just not affiliated with any religion at all, and kind of as a follow-up to that, how do you figure out the questions that you ask to even come up with those kinds of survey results, right? Because, of course, the question is going to largely dictate the result. And so what kind of process do you use to make sure you're formulating the questions that are going to get you the most bang for your buck, I guess?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with that second question. How do we design
that's
survey
great.
questions to get good information? And there's a couple things that come into play. Number one is we consult very widely with experts in the fields that we're studying, and also with people from a wide variety of backgrounds to try to make sure that we're asking good questions that can apply to everyone, that can be easily understood by everyone, and that accurately sort of capture the full spectrum of people's opinions or identities or experiences. So that's how we start. And what it means in practice is that a lot of times, for a lot of our surveys, we'll actually convene panels of advisors. So we recently conducted a survey last year all about spirituality and non-religion. And we impaneled a group of about half a dozen prominent academic experts in the study of those areas to help us design our questions. We've done similar things in the past when we've conducted surveys of Jewish Americans or Black Americans or Muslim Americans or Mormons, Catholics, you name it. So we often that's one place we often start when thinking about designing our questions. I can talk more about question design. We do a lot of testing of our questions to make sure they're working okay. We actually ask our respondents for their feedback about our questions. So we do a lot of things to help us design our questions, but maybe that's the place to start. We consult widely and make sure we're bringing people with a lot of different perspectives to the table. What about nuns in particular? The question that we ask, and that's, as you mentioned, important to stipulate, nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the religiously unaffiliated. We measure that group using a question that we designed all the way back in 2007. And we designed it specifically for our first ever religious landscape survey. Same kind of thing. We consulted widely. And what we wanted to do with this question, we knew from our own data that we'd collected before then, and also from data that a lot of other organizations had collected, that the share of Americans with no religion looked like it was trending upward. And so we wanted to make sure that our question, the question we asked people about their religious identity, gave people a chance to say that, to say they have no religion. So the question that we designed actually provided 3 options for people to say they have no religion. This is the question we ask, and it's the question we still ask to this day. What is your present religion, if any? The if any is important. It gives people permission, so to speak, to say they don't have any religion. What is your present religion, if any? Are you Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, that is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Orthodox Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, something else, or nothing in particular? So if you're counting, that gives people 12 options to choose from. 4 of them are Christian options. 4 of them are options associated with other faiths. 3 of them are indicators of no religious identity, atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular. And then, of course, very importantly, people have the chance to say something else. And if they say something else, they get a chance to tell us what that is. Back when we were doing telephone surveys, they would actually tell the interviewer what that is, and the interviewer would record it. So people would say there, I'm a Unitarian, or I'm Sikh, or I'm Rastafari. Literally dozens or hundreds of responses that people volunteer there, all in small numbers, but lots of different responses. So that's how we ask the question. And we take those 3 groups, atheists, agnostics, and those who say their religion is nothing in particular, and that's the group we call religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So where do they come from? Why are they growing so rapidly? Many of them, perhaps most of them, it's been a while since I looked at it, but many of them were in fact raised Christian. They certainly include people who have left Christianity as adults, people in their 30s and 40s and 50s who have moved away from Christianity or other faiths in favor of no religion as adults. But a huge part of what's going on, and something that's so crucial to understand about the religious nuns in the U.S., is that this is this is in large part a generational change. A big part of what's happening is you have young adults who are coming of age and entering adulthood with far lower levels of religiousness than their parents and their grandparents before them. And that's a big part of what's driving the nuns. It's partly older Americans, older adults leaving religion, but a big part of it is young adults entering adulthood without those religious connections to begin with. So there's a lot there, but I hope that sort of touches on several of those.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so to kind of get into the findings, so I want to just start with one of the questions that you had. So what should happen when the Bible and the will of the people conflict, which I thought was a really fascinating question to ask. So kind of two questions based off that. One, like, what are some of the findings? Two, you mentioned in the report that this was like the third time you've asked this particular question. So this is sort of like a mix between finding and process. Like, why would you want to ask the same question, like in a survey?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that. And I'll start with that one. I know I'm getting into a pattern of starting with the second question, but
so good.
Yeah, it's a great question. Why would we ask the same question on repeated occasions over the years? And the answer is because one of the things that we're interested in measuring is change over time. How is public opinion about this or that changing over time? How is the religious composition of the U.S. public changing over time? How are the background characteristics of people in the public changing over time? The only way to answer those questions about change over time is to ask the same question at multiple points in time. And by asking the same question at multiple points in time, you can look backwards and see how things have changed. There's a common saying in the public opinion world, public opinion polling world, and it goes something like this. If you want to measure change, you cannot change the measures. If you want to measure change,
that'll preach.
Yes, if you want to measure change, you cannot change the measures. The only way to see if something is changing is to measure it in the same way over time. So that's why we ask the same questions repeatedly over time. And when we go to design a new survey, the questions we asked before carry with them the mere fact that we asked them before sort of carries with them a very strong recommendation to ask them again. The only way to know if they've changed is to ask them again, exactly the same way. And there's this balancing act between wanting to improve your questions, right? We're all constantly striving to improve our measurements, to ask things better, more precisely, in a more understandable way. That's one motivation we as researchers have. But we also often want to measure change. And those two things are often in conflict with each other. And so sometimes we ask a question in the same way we asked it before. Even if we were starting over from scratch and we'd never asked anything before, maybe we'd do it a little differently, but we ask it the old way so that we can measure change. So I hope that answers the question of why we would measure things in the same way over time. In terms of that particular question about how much influence people want the Bible to have in U.S. lawmaking, that's one of my favorite questions in this survey, and it's one of my favorite questions we've asked in some time. It's actually a two-step question. First, we ask people, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, how much influence, if any, do you think the Bible should have on U.S. laws? A great deal, some, not much, or none at all. And people can answer that question sort of broadly. But in my mind, that question only tells you so much. We know that most Americans are Christians. We know that many Christians have a very high view of the Bible. So what does it mean to say, yes, I think the Bible should have some influence on U.S. laws? To get at that question, what does it mean to say that? We then ask a follow-up question. So if people said they want the Bible to have at least some influence on U.S. laws, we ask, well, follow-up question, what if the Bible and the will of the people are in conflict? What then? Which should prevail? Which should have more influence? Is it the Bible or is it the will of the people? And respondents can tell us. They can choose or they can volunteer that they'd rather not answer the question. And what we find is that about half of the public says they want the Bible to have at least some influence over U.S. laws. And a little more than half of them, 28% of U.S. adults, tell us that if the Bible and the will of the people conflict with each other about this or that, they think the Bible should actually take priority. The U.S. laws should reflect the Bible, not the will of the people. A quarter of the U.S. public expresses that view. It's higher among some groups than others. It's higher among white evangelical Christians than among many others, but it's also a common view among Black Protestants. It's more common among Republicans than Democrats. But overall, about a quarter of U.S. adults express that idea. The Bible should have some influence on U.S. laws. And if it conflicts with the will of the people, the Bible should take priority.
Got it. So many questions. Number one, this is really fascinating because I always feel like such a novice looking at data like this. And I'm curious of all the behind the scenes stuff that produce these results. So, the question about the Bible, unless I missed it, but did you ask any questions about the Quran or other sort of holy texts or anything like that?
We did not in this particular survey. We have done that on other occasions. So, for example, we have conducted 3 nationally representative surveys of Muslim Americans in 2007, 2011, and 2017. And in those kinds of specialized cases, we will indeed ask questions specifically about the Quran. We've done similar things with other groups as well. But in this particular case, in this survey, one of the topics that we were interested in exploring is something I'm sure you've heard a lot about. Maybe you've discussed it on in the podcast. Is Christian nationalism, what many people refer to as Christian nationalism. Yeah. And so our survey includes a variety of questions on that topic. And this particular question about how much influence the Bible should have was part of that module. So that's why we asked specifically about the Bible in this survey.
I think it's a fascinating question, and I think it's one that's definitely worth continuing to ask to see where the American public is along these lines. I have a question about your tell us about the results of kind of this sense of how people should interact with each other regarding religion and politics. For instance, one of the questions was, should people seek to change someone's mind? Should they listen to other people? Should they not talk about it at all? I'd love to get your take on that. And I know that you can't really give a lot of, policy, and that's not what I'm asking for, but kind of what were those trends? What were those results? Because as a pastor, I'm very fascinated in terms of thinking about evangelism and what that even looks like in our current context. And I'm not asking you to comment on that unless you want to, but more of just those results and what they mean.
Yeah, of course. So the survey asked a variety of questions that you could think of as sort of providing a window into how people perceive how people think their own religiousness fits into broader society. Do they a bunch of questions that sort of get at a theme of, do people feel like their own personal religious beliefs and characteristics fit well into our broader society, or is there some conflict there? And what the survey shows is increasing signs of tension felt by many people across a variety of religious groups between their own personal religious convictions and the broader society around them. So we can see, for example, that the share of Americans who say there's at least some conflict between their own religious beliefs and mainstream American culture, that number's going up. It now stands at about half of the public who says they see some conflict between their own religious beliefs and mainstream American culture. The share of Americans who say they think of themselves as a minority in the United States because of their religious beliefs, up 5 points.
Wow.
It's not as high. It's 29%. So it's a smaller share who say that, but still the share who say they think of themselves as a minority because of their religious beliefs is going up. And then we also asked the question I think you're referring to, well, what do you think it's best to do if you find yourself disagreeing with someone about religion? And what we find is that a growing share of the public says they think it's best to just not discuss it. Just drop it. Just avoid it. Don't go there. I think in the latest survey, it's something like 4 in 10 Americans say that if they disagree with somebody about religion, they just avoid the topic. There's another big share who say they talk about it in a desire to sort of learn where the other person is coming from and to share their own perspective. They talk about it, but sort of fundamentally agree to disagree. And then it's a much smaller share. I think it's only about 5% of the public who says in those kinds of cases, they find themselves trying to convince the other person of the correctness of their own religious beliefs. Excuse me, it's a tiny share of the public who says they think that's what's best to do. And we find a similar pattern when we ask a question about politics. What do you think you should do if you find yourself disagreeing with somebody about politics? A big share says avoid it. Another large share says, well, we can discuss it, see where each other's coming from, even though we're ultimately going to agree to disagree. And it's a very small share who say the right thing to do is to try to convince the other person of your own perspective. So that's another indicator, I think, of this. I think it fits well with these other indicators of sort of this growing sense of tension associated with an increased sort of reluctance to go there on the part of the public when it comes to religion.
It's so fascinating to me. And I just have like a quick, comment about this, because I feel like when it kind of indicates to me this sense that, this increasing sense of relative truth. And what I mean is like, hey, whatever that person thinks, that's their truth. That's okay. As long as they leave me alone. And I get that. And I tend in practice, of course, to think that that's a good way to live, in the sense of you're not certainly coercion of any kind, to view something would be wildly inappropriate in my view, except I would hate to think that argument in the official, not official, but in the academic sense of what that means of, hey, here are my reasons. I'm presenting this in order to persuade you to believe this or think this. I would certainly hope that, that argument wouldn't be seen as coercion of some kind. And I guess I'm not asking you to comment on that unless you want, but it's fascinating to me that we're so reticent to actually think it's okay to try to prove your point and hope to persuade others that they would, to agree. Listening, yes. But even beyond that, like, let's try to persuade others. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but I just thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know what it reminds me of when I saw these findings. What it reminds me of is polarization. The country is very is very polarized. It's polarized politically. Into Republican and Democratic camps. It's also polarized religiously in a variety of ways, and I think that's part of what you see reflected in this question. It's sort of this: we're so different. What is there really to be gained by discussing these things on which we're obviously so different? Another thing that it reminded me of is my colleagues in our political polling unit have asked this question I love several times over the years. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's something to the effect that in general, on the issues that matter to you in politics and public life, do you think your side has been winning or losing lately? Or winning more often than losing, or losing more often than winning? And huge numbers of people in lots of groups think their side has been losing. So there's this commonly shared perspective among lots of different groups, Republicans and Democrats, religious people and non-religious people, that they haven't been getting their way. Their side hasn't been winning. They're not seeing their preferences reflected in politics and public life around them. And I think what you see reflected there is a kind of frustration, and it might come out in these similar questions about, well, what do you do in the case of disagreement? There's this sense of disconnect that's widely felt between people's own values and how they see themselves fitting into the broader culture.
I don't know if you've ever asked this question, but it seems like it would be fitting for a religious survey is, do you think that your God has helped your football team? Because it's always like, you hear these people like, oh, I'm praying that the Seahawks are going to win, and oh, God's with this team today. You're just like, really? Like, I don't think so.
We haven't asked about football teams or the Super Bowl. That would be interesting. But we have asked people in a variety of ways over the years, how involved they think God is in their lives. And if they think God is involved, is that only in the big things, or is it also in the small things? And there's lots of people who do believe that God is involved even in the small things in their lives. We also asked a question years ago now, and I don't have the results ready at hand, but, and it must have been after the 2016 election. We asked people whether they thought God had been involved in the election of Donald Trump. And then we asked in the same survey, well, what about in the election of Barack Obama? Was God involved there too? And like in what sense was God involved? Is God involved in the sense that, things that happen in the world must be part of God's plan. So almost by definition, if Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Joe Biden is elected president, then of course that must be, or is it more directive, like God preferred the policies of this candidate over that candidate? And I forget how the results shook out, but yeah, these questions of God's involvement in the world are super interesting.
So funny. So I want to talk to you about Christian nationalism and kind of like what your survey sort of uncovered. But before I do, like how much do you rely on or reference check like other, survey organizations, like the PRI or Barna Group or anything like that?
Well, we're always looking for good ideas for topics and survey questions. I think, and especially like long running surveys that have historic trends. So think about the Gallup organization, or sometimes the General Social Survey, which is a long running academic survey. Questions that go back really far in time. Those can be, as we said, if you want to measure change and you have a long-standing question, those can be good sources. We probably rely on those more than like a PRRI or something like that. But another source of information that we often rely on is there's lots of sources, but we pay attention to the academic literature about political science, about religion, about the intersection of religion and politics. And as you know, there's been a growing body of academic literature over the last decade or more about Christian nationalism. And we followed that very closely and modeled some of our questions over the years on some of that good academic work, including sort of pioneering survey work done by Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry. They've really kind of pioneered this field, and we've consulted with them over the years on some of our surveys and try to pick up on some of that so that we're contributing to the conversations that are already underway.
Great guys, by the way. Yeah, we've had them on the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're terrific.
Yeah,
they've been hugely helpful to us over the years in thinking about some of these questions.
Absolutely, they are awesome. So, one of my questions is, when we're thinking about like the religiosity of Trump and Biden, how important is that? What did the survey kind of help us understand about it? And then how important is it? How important is it that they are religious to the American public?
Not so important, as it turns out. We did ask people on this survey a variety of questions about the kinds of traits they would like to see in a president. Would you like to see a president who personally lives a moral and ethical life? Would you like to see a president who is personally very religious, himself or herself? Would you like to see a president who stands up for people with your religious beliefs? Would you like to see a president who shares your religious beliefs? And what we see is that almost everybody, more than 9 in 10 Americans from across the political divide and across the religious spectrum, they say they want a president who lives a moral and ethical life. That's number one. That is almost universal, about as universal as it gets in the United States today. People want a president who personally lives a moral and ethical life. Many people, a smaller share, but many people, most people, tell us they want a president who's going to stand up for people with religious beliefs like theirs. So people want somebody who's going to stand up for their religion. It's less important, people tell us, to have a president who is personally very religious, and even less important than that, to have a president who personally shares your religious beliefs. So that's what people tell us. Now, how do they view Donald Trump and Joe Biden? Most people don't think either one of them are especially religious. I think it's in the low double digits or the single digits who say either one of them are very religious. And one of the things that's interesting to me, we know that we talked a little bit about how politically polarized the country is. We know Republicans don't have a positive opinion of Joe Biden and Democrats don't have a positive opinion of Donald Trump. So we know that. But one of the things that's really interesting to me in this survey is that even most Democrats don't think Joe Biden is especially religious. And even most Republicans don't think Donald Trump is especially religious. So even the people who tend to be positively disposed toward Joe Biden and Donald Trump don't think they're especially religious. But they do think that their preferred candidate stands up for people with religious beliefs like theirs. Many Democrats, including some of the religious constituencies within the Democratic Party, so big numbers of Black Protestants and big numbers of Jewish Americans, tell us they think Joe Biden stands up for people with religious beliefs like theirs. And many white evangelical Protestants on the right tell us that they think Donald Trump stands up for religious beliefs like theirs. So it's not so much that these folks share their religious beliefs, but their supporters generally do think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are willing to stand up for people with their religious beliefs.
That's so interesting. So I want to kind of go back to my earlier question, just to kind of maybe have you elaborate a little bit more about what did your survey find out about Christian nationalism? What are sort of the broader, public sentiment? Do they even know about it? What have you?
Yeah. So there's a few things to note there. So we asked a couple of questions directly about Christian nationalism. That we asked a couple of questions that use that term. So we asked people, how much, if anything, have you seen or heard about Christian nationalism? And then if they say they've heard of it, we asked a follow-up question. Well, in general, do you have a favorable or an unfavorable view of it? And the results are super interesting. More than half of people say they've never heard of it.
That's amazing.
And that number hasn't changed over the last year and a half. I think it's 54% of U.S. adults say they have totally unfamiliar with the term, haven't seen or heard anything about it. 45% of Americans say they have heard at least a little about it. But the thing is that many of them have only heard a little about it. And if you ask them the follow-up question, well, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of it? Only 5% of U.S. adults say they've heard of Christian nationalism and they have a favorable view of it. There's a bigger share who say they've heard of it and they have an unfavorable opinion of it. And then the big majority of people say they've either never heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they really don't know enough about it to say one way or the other. They might have heard of the term, but they're not really familiar with what it entails. So that's what we see when we ask people specifically about the term. So because of that, because this is a term that most people are unfamiliar with, and because it's a term that, frankly, has a lot of baggage associated with it, people who use the term tend to say that it means a lot of negative things. Being a Christian nationalist means one is racist, misogynistic, anti-immigrant, patriarchal, intolerant. Because it's unfamiliar to people and because it has negative connotations associated with it, we don't ask people whether they themselves are Christian nationalists. And we don't have a group in our survey that we call Christian nationalists. And we say, look, here's a group of people that's Christian nationalists, and here's how big it is, and here's their characteristics. We don't have that. But we do ask people a bunch of questions that, without using that terminology, kind of touch on some of the ideas that scholars of Christian nationalism say it's about. We talked already about the question we asked about the Bible and whether or not it should have influence on U.S. laws. In this survey, we asked a couple of other questions. We asked people, do you think the federal government should stop enforcing separation of church and state, or should it keep enforcing separation of church and state? And what we see there is that about 16% of the public says they think the government should stop enforcing separation of church and state. We asked another question, do you think the federal government should officially declare Christianity to be the official religion of the United States? Or would you say the government should sort of rely on Christian principles, but not declare Christianity the official religion? Or should the government stay away from Christianity altogether? 13% of the public says that they want the federal government to declare Christianity the nation's official religion. So a fairly small group. Then we did this interesting analysis where we took those two questions, and we also took the question about the Bible and whether or not it should have influence on U.S. laws. And we said, well, what if we count all these things together? What if we count them all up? How many people say they think the Bible should influence U.S. laws, and if it conflicts with the will of the people, the Bible should take priority? So number one, Bible preeminent authority on U.S. laws. And also say the government should stop enforcing separation of church and state. And also say the government should officially declare Christianity the religion of the land. If you put all that together, 3% of the public expresses all three of those points of view, a fairly small group. So that's not to minimize the prevalence of these views. There certainly are people who want to see closer intermingling of church and state in American life. But it is to say, it does sort of point up the need, we sort of began this conversation, the need to take care about being precise about what we're referring to. What did we measure? How did we measure it? How does it all fit together? I think that kind of analysis sort of points up that need.
That's so fascinating, man. This has been an unbelievable conversation. I would love if we had time to keep going, and maybe we can have you back on to talk more about this kind of stuff. I think it would be amazing. How can people keep up to date on Pew Research, on you and your research? If you have anything in particular, how can they get in contact, ask questions, things like that?
Yeah, of course. They can find one of the cool things about working at Pew Research Center is that we make all of our research and even all of our raw data available to anybody who wants it for free.
That's awesome.
We have a terrific website where you can find reports about everything we've discussed today, including these methodological questions, www.pewresearch.org. That's PEW research.org. All of our reports are there. And there's also links there to more information about me and to, this is a pretty big place. There's about 170 or so people who work here. So many of my terrific colleagues who focus on these and other areas. I would say too, it's been great to discuss this information, these data we've collected over the last few months. But as you know, we're in an election year.
Yes.
We're not going to stop. We're going to keep collecting data in the months to come about people's political preferences, and we've already got tons of information on their religious characteristics. So we're going to have a lot more to say about religion and politics in the months to come. So pewresearch.org, everything you could need is available there.
That's great. Well, I mean, we would love to have you back on the show to talk about some of those results as they come up in this election.
That would be great.
Season. Well, this has been Dr. Gregory A. Smith. Thank you, Greg, for being on the show with us today.
See you again.
Thank you again for having me. It'd be great to do it again.
Absolutely. And so you've heard it from Greg himself. You guys can go check out their website, and we encourage you to do that and look at all their data. It's great. And we want to encourage that. And to our listeners and watchers, thank you for joining this conversation. And until we see you again, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.